You are listening to Fantha Tracks.
Fast ship. Never heard of the William Fall?
Should I have?
It's the ship that made the Kessel run in less than 12 parsecs.
What a piece of junk.
Covering Star Wars vehicles in less than 12 parsecs, this is Start Your Engines.
Don't get technical with me.
Here are your hosts, Paul Naylor and Mark Newbold.
You're listening to Start Your Engines. I'm your co-host, Mark Newbold, and joining me today is a man who, if he was flying a TIE fighter, he would fly it straight into the middle of the Death Star and then park up for lunch. Paul, how you doing?
Big Mac, large fries and a milkshake, please. Chocolate.
To go?
Yeah, well, I'm not parking here.
Okay, fair enough. Sounds reasonable. How you doing, man?
I'm cool, mate. How are you?
I'm very well. I think our first episode of Start Your Engines, long overdue, went down rather well. We've had some good feedback.
We have, yeah. It's been lovely to hear the feedback, yeah. It's always nice when you get a pat on the back, and yeah, thanks, folks.
Unless you're a farmer, in which case it's a real imposition. Last episode, or rather, last technical manual, we spoke about the Millennium Falcon. This technical manual, we're going to talk about the TIE Fighter. We were going to talk about like all TIE Fighters, but then doing our research realised there's way more to talk about just about that original TIE Fighter than I think we ever gave it credit for, really.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the original trilogy TIE Fighter, we had it through Star Wars Empire, Jedi, and I think it made appearances in other properties.
It did. Well, I mean, Rogue One, obviously, retroactively. Rebels, but it's kind of more the Macquarie version, isn't it? So we're going to focus on, again, on the OT and Rogue One.
Technical specifications.
So let's start off with a bit of technical information about the TIE/IN Space Superiority Starfighter. As we just call it, the TIE Fighter. 7.24 metres in length, 6.7 metres wide, 8.82 metres deep. It's a bigger ship than you realise, isn't it?
Well, I'm trying to get my head around all those figures. Yeah, it's huge. You know, you think of it as a one-man fighter, which it is, certainly in the original trilogy. Those are pretty big dimensions.
It has a maximum acceleration of 4,100 G, which in Star Wars terms is 100 mg/lt, and it's got a maximum atmospheric speed of 1,200 kilometres an hour, so that baby can move.
Manufacturer.
The TIE Starfighter, it was a small short-range fighter. It was developed, manufactured and mass-produced by Sinar Fleet Systems, and its history can be traced back to the Kuat Systems Engineering's Alpha 3 Nimbus Starfighter, which was the ship you see right at the end of the Sith.
Oh, right, okay. I didn't realise it was related to that. It's pretty much got the same shape in all its different forms over the years. And I suppose a lot of people also thought that Darth Maul's ship looked similar to a TIE Fighter from certain angles, but then has got that elongated front to it as well.
With the original Star Wars ships, and I think the sequel trilogy was smart in the way that they went back to those silhouettes, because especially in New Hope, all about silhouettes. You recognise Vader, you recognise Chewie. The TIE Fighter is instantly recognisable, and kids can draw it like an X-Wing or the Death Star. It's easy to do.
I mean, I did enjoy seeing those ships again. However, with the prequel trilogy having such different designs, which set that apart from, you know, the original three films, in some ways I would have liked completely fresh ideas for the new trilogy, rather than here's another TIE Fighter, here's another X-Wing. It's almost a little bit too twee. Don't get me wrong, I still enjoyed it. Enjoyed the new versions, particularly. I quite like the scene in The Force Awakens where it crashes down onto Jakku with Finn and Poe in it. But yeah, in some ways I think it would have been nice to have deviated from that.
Like its predecessors, it had two vertical wings. The ETA-2 Actis-class light interceptor, which is Jedi Starfighter from Revenge of the Sith, obviously has more similarities because of that central cockpit, twin iron engines. There's a commonality with the weapons. You're right what you say about the sequel trilogy as well, in that I think going back to that era, to have that familiarity and those familiar shapes and sizes, even though those TIE Fighters were bigger and had hyperdrives and shields and such that the classic one didn't. I don't think a classic TIE Fighter could have survived a crash the way that one did. No. So that was definitely a step up. It was the most ubiquitous ship. You see more TIE Fighters really than anything else.
So easy to draw as a kid as well, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You drew a circle in the circle, and then you drew a couple of wings off it. You know, it was such an easy one to draw. And I don't know about you, Mark, but it was certainly one of the first ships that I had for my action figures as well.
My TIE Fighter, which is the other side of the room, was certainly a Star Wars box TIE Fighter. I don't have the box anymore, but it was definitely the white plastic one. So yeah, that would be pretty. That and the X-Wing, I would say, were probably my first two ships.
And when those, I think those were my first two. I think I had the Land Speeder as well. But the first two ships, the TIE Fighter and the X-Wing, interestingly, when they came out, neither of them had pilots available for them. So you stuck a Stormtrooper in your TIE Fighter, and you stuck Luke in his farm boy clothes into the X-Wing. So, which was a shame, really, wasn't it? I mean, we had to wait a lot longer for a TIE pilot than we did for Luke in his X-Wing gear.
TIE fighter pilot was Empire era, wasn't it?
Yeah, and not even the first line.
That's true. That's very true.
Engine specs.
The TIE fighter's name's derived from its propulsion system, which was designed to make that distinct noise to inspire fear in its opponents, which I think is really interesting because, and again, I know we're not talking about Force Awakens, but the best example of the TIE fighter's sound, I think, is that scene on Jakku when they're running away, and you can, even though it's a different model of TIE fighter, it's 30 years on, that sound is so instantly recognisable.
It's great seeing them in space, but then when you see them that close to a planet's surface, it's pretty ominous, aren't it?
More so than you think.
It's that screeching sort of foreboding noise as it's coming towards you. And, you know, you've got Rey and Finn running away from that class of TIE fighter. But I think if we'd have seen something like that in perhaps A New Hope, obviously technology-wise they wouldn't have been able to have done it anywhere near as good as they can now. But to have seen some TIE fighters landing maybe in the special edition, I mean, we saw that one shuttle taking off with the dewbacks in the foreground. Maybe if we'd have seen a few TIE fighters landed there or zooming off, that would have been fantastic. I don't know what it is. I just love seeing them with blue sky rather than out in space. Yeah. That's why I think I love it so much in The Mandalorian.
So that's a great point, because one thing that they did in The Mandalorian that I wish they'd done before was that split wing.
Oh, when it landed.
When it lands, when Gideon's TIE fighter lands, that's just such a genius move, because you've seen it back in West End Games days. You've had other vehicles deliver TIE fighters. You see them drop out in Rogue One. Yeah. So there's all these different delivery methods. And then to see that in The Mandalorian, the way it lands, I was like, that is so damn clever.
Of course it is. And also it's much easier to get in and out of than an X-Wing that appears to have a disappearing yellow ladder.
Well, we'll get to X-Wings another day, but that's a very, very good point. They originally had two PS3 ion engines, but eventually they were replaced by twin PS4 ion engine. PS4.
Which apparently you have to take out every now and then, rub them together, put them back in, and it works again.
Technical manual. They expel charged particles, which along almost any vector, which means they're incredibly manoeuvrable, and that's something that really does show up throughout the trilogy, isn't it? The original trilogy, especially.
Certainly in The Empire Strikes Back. Not so much in A New Hope. They seem pretty static in that.
Yeah.
When you got to the special edition, you got to see the manoeuvrability a little bit more. But once you get to that asteroid field chase, that's when you really appreciate how manoeuvrable they are. Yeah.
One of the interesting parts in the research was seeing that they don't have many moving parts or high-temperature components. Only 5% of TIE fighters were lost in the field as a result of that kind of attrition. They didn't wear down. They didn't break down. That wasn't something that was an issue. They were brilliantly designed.
The Ford Fiesta from outer space.
The Harrison Ford Fiesta. The fuel was a radioactive gas that was kept in pressurised fuel tanks, which were on the underside of the cockpit. And I'm pretty sure if we look at the amount of TIE fighters that get hit, it's probably there that pops them, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I wouldn't want to have that sat right behind me.
The twin ion engines, there was a W401 manoeuvring jets, which gave it thrust and boosters capable of adjusting its direction. And the tie-in featured vertical takeoff and landing, so it was basically like a Harrier jump jet.
It's a shame we never got to see that.
Don't you think, though? I mean, a slight off topic, but now we're in the VFX era we're in now, and that we know these films so well, that if you could have the opportunity to go back and add in flourishes, I'm not talking about changing things or adjusting things, but just extra additional elements that show and highlight a capability like that. It would be amazing to do, wouldn't it?
It would, yeah. I mean, it would be there purely as frivolous sort of fan service, really, but so cool to see.
Hyperdrive system.
So it was a light vehicle. It's big because of the solar panels. Physically takes up a big space, but actually quite light. And because it doesn't have a hyperdrive and its navigational systems alongside its extended life support and the fuel, they all cut down its mass. So really, what you're trying to say, okay, it's an expendable ship. They make loads of them. We know how the Empire treats its staff, stroke servants, stroke whatever you want to call them, but they banged out these TIE fighters at pace, but they're really, really well made.
The fact that you've got to carry them into battle aboard a Star Destroyer,
I
don't think that sort of lessens the quality of it in any way, shape or form. I think once you've got to where you're going and you release them, they're pretty formidable, aren't they? If you were in an X-Wing and you've got 3 or 4 of those on your tail, you wouldn't want that.
Vehicle usages.
individual TIE fighters were used for scouting, which I think that's probably the one you would come across in A New Hope when they're going towards the Death Star.
Yeah.
A pair of fighters will be used to escort shuttles and other craft, as you see in Jedi, Darth Vader going to the Death Star too. 4 TIE fighters was called a sentry group, but that's what you see attacking the Falcon as they leave the Death Star, and they were deployed to patrol the areas around an Imperial ship or a facility, so you generally see a quartet of those ships. A typical attack squadron was 12 fighters, and 6 squadrons together made up a full attack wing of 72. So your point is well made because, you've got these different breakdowns of the vessels to sort out and take care of different situations. You've got to imagine by the time you get to Return of the Jedi and the Battle of Endor, you're not talking sentries, you're not talking squadrons, you're talking attack wings of TIE fighters piling in.
That scene that you're alluding to there, the one where you've got all those TIE fighters coming towards the screen and you've got interceptors.
Yeah.
But you will still have the traditional TIE fighter in there as well. I think that was one of the most complex shots.
At the time it was, yeah.
However, I mean, it would be fantastic to freeze frame that and try and work out roughly how many there are. But yeah, more than 72.
Definitely more than 72.
Hull.
So in order to keep those costs down, because even though the War Machine is galaxy-wide and they're creaming in taxation and they're using people as slaves and Wookiees as slaves and other races are just being subjugated left, right and centre, there's still a financial and fiscal cost to the war. The Trade Federation has been brought within the Empire. All of these different elements are now just the Galactic Empire. But to reduce costs and mass and energy consumption, but also improving manoeuvrability, it lacked deflector shields. We see that a lot. The Falcon hits a TIE fighter once, it goes boom, clips an asteroid, spins off, it's gone, it's in trouble. It was armoured with Canadium steel plating, which was proof against handheld blasters, so it could take blaster fire from a person, apart from when they aimed it at the stabilisers, but it could be penetrated by direct hits from military-grade laser cannons, which the Falcon is pretty heavily stacked. Heavy blaster cannons, micro-meteor impact, so it can even be taken out just in space, being hit by tiny meteoroids. There's no deflector shield, so it's completely vulnerable. But the spherical shape meant that glancing blows were generally directed away. That's speaking to the design rather than its defences.
It's the amount of detail and thought that goes into this sort of content. It's incredible, really, isn't it? The fact that somebody has sat down and thought, right, its strengths and its weaknesses. Okay, it's mass-produced. We all know the Emperor and Vader, particularly the Emperor. Throw some more monkeys at it. Just interesting that we didn't really think about anything to do with the financial aspect of how much these things cost. No. I'm talking about in their galaxy, not in ours. Until we got to the political side of the prequel trilogy, where it was all about trade federations and costs, etc. We didn't think about that. It was goodies and baddies when we were kids. And it was probably still goodies and baddies for the adults that were watching it back then as well. Nothing about money.
Not really, no. I mean, the Marvel run kind of sort of touched on it a little bit, very peripherally. But yeah, I mean, everything has a price. Everything's got a financial cost. What I love about that is that the detail there about the cockpit, when they designed the TIE fighter, that wouldn't have been in their head. They were just looking at aesthetics. Yeah. Because it's a space vehicle there's no friction in space and they're not worrying about a lot of elements. Yeah. But as you delve into it and look at things, and there's a certain serendipity, like, actually, that cockpit design, there'd be some logic to that. So I think all these things just stack up and come together. It's Star Wars, isn't it? It's a magic that's in there. You don't even know how it got there.
I mean, they can afford to throw all that money away, but why couldn't they put a cover on that thermal exhaust port on the Death Star? That would have saved them a lot of trouble.
And a lot of sequels.
Hello, I'm Dennis Lawson, and you're listening to Fantha Tracks.
The TIE Fighter's black wings were actually an array of 12 solar collectors framed by rigid quadanium steel foil braces. So it was solar powered, much like yourself, that feature a micro-crenulated solar absorption surface.
You can type this, George, but you can't say it.
Yes, thank you, Star Wars. That's exactly right. The power would be pulled to its solar energy collection hub. So really, when they're out in deep space, obviously they're using their reserves, but in atmosphere, sunlight bouncing around, it's only helping to fuel the ship.
Look how much more green the Empire's ethics were than the Rebellion's.
Actually, there's a crazy amount of logic to that, saving the galaxy one solar panel by one. The wings used to power its armament, but that was found to drain the fighter of energy, and it affected its manoeuvrability. So those were powered elsewhere.
I just find it fascinating that they were solar powered. Who knew?
I'm literally watching your mind blow as I'm standing here. Those early fighters were later retrofitted with a dedicated generator for the lasers, and the wings were also stabilisers. So obviously looking at that shape, I suppose if you sort of drew corner to corner, it's a cube, isn't it, essentially?
It is, yeah. You think of it as a circle, it is.
Yeah.
It's a square or a cube, like you say.
Yeah.
I mean, it was always good for playing with your figures because it stood nicely.
You could almost put your figures within the span of the floor space of the ship as well, couldn't you?
Backdrop, wasn't it? When you'd only got sort of like 20 figures when you were a kid, and you got that. Ooh, nice backdrop. It was interesting that from the toy line perspective, how they went from the white TIE fighter and then it came out as like a blue.
Yeah.
What was that about? Was that a truer colour, do you believe? Or do you think that the colour that it was meant to be white? Because certainly I think on film it comes across as being white in A New Hope.
I'm looking across at that. Can you see that uncut sheet from Empire Trading Cards? Yeah. I'm thinking we always thought Han Solo's coat was blue, and we learned years later it was brown. Yeah. And I think there's been that many different sort of colour gradients and different... Mark Morcaster knows way more about this working for Sky, but I think there's an element of that at play. I think maybe there's a touch of that because, you look at that classic TIE and you do think white, but then you see Interceptor, no doubt the Interceptor's like a grey, like Darth Vader's TIE.
Could be that the actual TIE fighter's colour looks not quite what it should be because of the technology that was used to create the scene.
One thing we can say with certainty, it definitely wasn't purple. Those wings were sturdy enough to double as landing gears, which again reduced its overall mass. Doesn't need landing gears or anything. That's very useful. But they were designed and deployed to be retrieved using special cycling racks, which goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Standard on Star Destroyers and other Imperial facilities, and each rack had a capacity of, attack wing, 72 fighters. As well as allowing pilots and technicians to access the craft more easily, that system was also equipped with a small tractor beam projector to assist with landing operations. So it was able to pull them in and tractor them out and drop them and such. So I think Rogue One is the best example of that with the original TIE fighter, isn't it? When you see it dropping out the racks and swinging out over Scarif.
Yeah, you do, don't you? Yeah.
Because you kind of see them in A New Hope, this special edition, when Solo runs around the corner, you see all the stormtroopers they've added, and in the background you see all the TIEs in the racks.
Yes, yeah.
One of the drawbacks to the TIE fighter's design, it obscured the pilot's view. You think about looking out of the cockpit, left and right, you've got those foils, those solar panels either side. But Imperial authorities considered that an acceptable motivation for pilots to concentrate on the targets in front of them. I think that's genius. Forget the asteroid that's coming from the left. Forget the asteroid that's coming from the right. Just look ahead and don't blink. If part of the wings were removed to increase sight, it would cost the vehicle stability, which would then hamper the ship's ability to engage in dogfights. So it is a bit of take from one hand and give with the other, isn't it?
It wouldn't have hurt to put a bit more glass around the side, would it?
Like transparent steel or something.
Yeah, why not? Just make it a little bit easy for the devils. Oh dear, no. I do feel sorry for TIE pilots.
The wings did provide some measure of additional protection for the cockpit, and the fighter's sensor array compensated for the blind spots by augmenting and expanding the pilot's visual range. So they're working off sensors, basically. It's Star Wars Arcade, isn't it?
Yeah, and also going back to like the battle over the first Death Star, when you went to the internal cockpit shots, the technology in a TIE fighter was clearly more advanced than what you got in an X-Wing.
Yeah.
So they clearly got the big bucks, even though it's only now that we can think about the money. But yeah, whilst they might not have had the peripheral vision that you got as an X-Wing pilot, I'm sure they've got all sorts of different things that made up for that internally.
I don't think they've ever really done it to any great degree. I mean, we got it in TIE Fighter versus X-Wing back in the day, but, to see the interior of a TIE Fighter cockpit, and they're wearing a helmet as well, which has got heads up inside the helmet. So you're right, beyond what you see in the cockpit, there's stuff inside the helmet. X-Wing pilots don't have that. It's digital versus analog, isn't it?
I think the best single image that I've ever seen of the inside of a TIE fighter, be it Darth Vader's TIE fighter, was when you and I went to Dave Prowse's last personal appearance. Jason had brought along a load of previously unseen photos, and there was a fantastic one of Vader inside the cockpit of his TIE fighter. And you got to see all the instrumentation from an angle that I'd not seen before. And I think that's the best I've ever seen of it. Some really fantastic images that day, but that one stuck with me.
It's interesting, I think, with Vader, you're right with all the instrumentation, but you imagine Vader's, of all the people, Anakin, who can fly anything, if the inside of his cockpit had been a smooth ball and there was just, accelerator, brake and nothing more, him using the Force would be enough. But they always said, and we're in a new canon era now. I say new, it's been around for years. But, we're in a new era now. I don't know whether Vader's TIE fighter is still considered to be the prototype for the Interceptor. That's what it always was when we were kids, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's how it was sold to us. Because all of a sudden we saw the TIE Interceptors being sort of marketed before the film came out. We were thinking, hang on, that looks awfully like Vader's TIE fighter. I still think that if somebody goes to you, TIE fighter, you don't think about the Interceptor, you don't think about Darth Vader's, you draw the standard TIE fighter that appeared in the original trilogy.
For everything in one location, daily news, reviews, interviews, podcasts, video and social media feeds, bookmark fanthatracks.com. for Star Wars News 24/7, 365.
Obviously, we see it in space and we see it in atmosphere. Not so often in the original trilogy, but certainly in more recent fare, like The Mandalorian. But it was first and foremost designed for space combat. But whilst it was capable of operating within a planetary atmosphere, it was at a massive disadvantage versus things like the X-Wing, because its hexagonal wings would, because of wind shear and just atmospheric pressure, would just make it harder to steer and harder to manoeuvre. Yeah, exactly. It's just much more difficult. If it attempted to reverse too hard in order to break its speed, it also risked causing severe structural damage. So it could literally break itself by braking too hard.
To roll as well. I mean, well, you've seen when they have been downed, it spins like crazy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, it's the same with Moff Gideon as well.
Yeah. So whilst it's a very good vehicle in atmosphere, it's at a massive disadvantage against something like an X-Wing. When operating in tight urban confines and oxygen-rich atmospheres, for example, it was equal to an X-Wing in speed and manoeuvrability. I found that really interesting. In the right circumstances, it's every bit as powerful as an X-Wing.
Always thought of them as like for like. I don't know about you,
Yeah.
but I mean, you know, you couldn't imagine one without the other, really. That was your dogfight, wasn't it? That was your World War II dogfight. If you'd got a TIE fighter, you needed to have an X-Wing and vice versa, because that was the true battle.
That's the fight.
Yeah, I mean, you do think of the Falcon, particularly when you get to the Empire Strikes Back in the asteroid field. But for me, you'll always think of the X-Wing and the TIE fighter. They're together all the time, aren't they?
Weapons specs.
Its primary armament, it was a pair of LS-1 low-temperature laser cannons. By the time of the Battle of Endor, they'd been replaced with LS-7.2 laser cannons. Imperial weapons have the green laser bolts, and the Rebel weapons have the red laser bolts. So the green bolts that they fired was a result of the more expensive blaster gas that the Empire used, so they could identify their own shots. I thought that was really interesting. That obviously to delineate between the two for us as viewers, it's like football teams wearing different coloured shirts. But nevertheless, there's an actual in-universe reason they're using expensive gas.
I'd never even thought about the different colours of the laser fire. Oh my goodness, I'm going to have to watch that.
Mind blown again. They had an advanced TS-8 targeting computer, which was later replaced with the TS-9A. It was superior to the targeting computers on Rebel fighters, so they had those. It goes back to what you were saying. You look at the cockpit, you think, well, clearly an Imperial cockpit's targeting computer, visually, just from what we saw, was more sophisticated than a Rebel one.
Sensor systems.
As all fighter craft were equipped with forms of sensor jammer equipment, the targeting computer cut down on the amount of time it needed to obtain a target lock. So they're going to lock onto a Rebel ship quicker than a Rebel ship's going to lock onto them. Helps having the Force, though, doesn't it?
It certainly does help having the Force. I mean, if Anakin was as good a pilot as we think he is, I'm still surprised that Luke didn't get popped off in A New Hope. Do you think he was sort of like holding back?
I think from a story point of view, you're probably right. We know what Lucas wrote in 77 and we saw on the screen in Star Wars, and what came to be in Empire and Jedi and everything else wasn't fully formed and worked out. So a lot of what we assume about Star Wars especially is almost assumption based on what we learned later on.
A New Hope's designed to be a standalone film. If it hadn't have been the success it had been, it would have been fine to have left as it was.
Well, here's a thought for you then. If there was one scene that was missing from Star Wars that didn't lead you into there having the potential of a sequel, it will be seeing Darth Vader's TIE fighter spin away and him fly off. If they didn't have those scenes in it, it could have just been left. But because it's a bit like seeing Spock's coffin at the end of Star Trek 2, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like, we will be back. But yeah, you're right. Star Wars works as a thing on its own.
It does, absolutely.
Between that solar array and the main body of the craft, there was a stabiliser, which we mentioned earlier. It was exposed from the hull armour, and it could be exploited by a well-placed shot, which clearly it often was. The stabiliser, when you think, it goes back to what you said about the TIE fighter spinning off. Yeah. You think the asteroid field. You see the one TIE fighter pilot just spin, you see the pilot eject. Those ships, once they've lost that stabiliser, they're just fairground attractions, aren't they?
Once we got to the Empire Strikes Back and we saw the TIE fighters again, yes, I enjoyed the TIE fighters in the original film, but once you got to that asteroid field sequence, that's when you felt the speed and the manoeuvrability of a TIE fighter and the threat, and also the vulnerability of it as well, though. To be taken out by a baked potato is no mean feat. But, when you get that one that's sort of spinning and screaming towards the screen with the cockpit all lit up on fire and everything, and I think we see a pilot thrown from it, don't we? Yeah. That's just amazing to see that. They were certainly not up to the job when he got to an asteroid field.
Hi, this is John Morton from The Empire Strikes Back, and you're listening to Fantha Tracks.
Countermeasures.
Now, this you will like, because this takes us back to the toy.
Oh, hurrah.
So it didn't have many essential systems. It had a limited operational lifespan, But there was a theft prevention system on board the TIE Fighter, which I did not know about. So if anybody was going to defect, there was this system to stop them from defecting, not being stolen, but defecting. It was a countermeasure that basically would jettison the fighter's solar collection panels linked to the main body through a stabilizer. So basically, they could pop the wings off. That's your classic toy.
Wow, that's fantastic. Was the Kenner and Palitoy version the same?
I believe so. I couldn't swear to it. I'm not enough of an expert, and I know there's plenty of folks out there that would know, but I believe they were.
I think mine would have been the Palitoy version, but I remember it having that really authentic laser cannon sound. And you push the button, and a little red light on the front,
lights,
which you'd go upstairs into your bedroom, you'd shut all the curtains, you go, wow, look at that, it's amazing. But the fact that you could pop the wings off, that was the big part of that toy, wasn't it?
Oh, totally. That was completely the selling point. I mean, you had the little hook at the top where the cockpit would pop open, which was great. Yeah. That little button thing on the back when the wings popped, especially when you were really moving it around at speed and your mates flying the Falcon, and you get that moment when the TIE Fighter goes down and pop that button, the wings go spinning off, and Super 8 cinefilm kind of cool.
Now, do you think that bit of detail that you talked about there, do you think that evolved from the toy?
I do. I think when they did, I might be getting this wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was season 7 of Clone Wars, when in the background you saw Hammerhead in his onesie, and you saw the classic Cantina characters in their Kenner and Palitoy clothing. I think there's a lovely little loving desire to want to work these things back in, and to me that bit of information is totally someone's gone, let's make logic of these wings popping off. But it makes sense, doesn't it? It's like, you think theft prevention, it's not theft prevention, it's defection prevention. That is an in-universe logical step, isn't it?
That's sort of like, you might want to take this, but nobody's having it now. Bang, it's gone. Like, try flying that now. I'm so glad that they've done that, rather than just have like a yellow and grey sort of metal casing that goes over the steering wheel with a lock. I mean, I'm from an era where I'm now thinking it's perhaps got a beaded seat cushion as well.
Crew compliment.
Modern TIE Fighters, Force Awakens era, you can have 2 people in the cockpit, back to back. But in this era, it was a single flyer. So the central cockpit was tightly fitted, incorporating its flight controls, view screens, targeting systems, and tracking equipment. There was a homing beacon in case it was stolen or somebody wanted to defect, so you pop the wings off, and room for a pilot, all in that central pod. So it's mega claustrophobic. The guy's got his helmet on, so even more. So that would be a genuine consideration to take into account. You imagine training as a TIE Fighter pilot and then sitting in the cockpit for the first time and I can't breathe.
It's like the Russian doll sort of theory. It's like a helmet within a helmet.
Within a helmet.
Cargo capacity.
Despite being designed for that single occupant, several other passengers could fit inside a central cockpit.
Really?
Feasibly could fit in, although it would be extremely tight. A pressurised seal allowed the cockpit to retain an atmosphere, and a minimal perfunctory oxygen scrubbers would protect the equipment, but the lack of any life support meant pilots had to wear that flight suit and vacuum-sealed flight helmets, and they had 2 days consumable. So basically, I think what they're saying is there's enough air that you could take your helmet off, grab something to eat, put your helmet back on, and that's what would keep you safe. But the oxygen scrubbers would just about keep it ticking over, and your food would run out in 2 days anyway. And do you think the Empire is going to spend the money to come and pick you up? I think you're pretty screwed.
Comm systems.
They basically have black boxes that have onboard data recorders, which sits beneath the pilot's seat. It's designed to survive any event which would otherwise destroy the TIE Fighter and scatter it into little bits. They can come back and retrieve it later. I just wonder, thinking of that TIE Fighter pilot in Empire that spins off in his seat, whatever happened to him? I do know a certain point of view the Empire short stories novel did touch upon that, but I just wonder whether or not they did retrieve the flight data from the seat.
Navigation system.
TIE Fighter flight controls, they're intuitive, they're easy to learn. I mean, we know Han Solo learned to fly a TIE Fighter, Valance learned to fly a TIE Fighter, so there's characters we know that are familiar with TIE Fighters. That allowed Rebel novices to fly and operate them, having stolen them. Again, that's a sequence that's happened in some of the comics. They're also outfitted with the ejector seat, which of course we know from Empire Strikes Back. The guy was very quick to get out of there. There's an anti-grav unit, an automated safety system, and the seat was designed to pilot it away from the debris, so it would just literally just hurl them away, even in space, just get away from it as quick as possible.
Behind the scenes.
One of the classic visual scenes in Empire Strikes Back, isn't it?
It's just that moment that you just think, this has been a major leap in 3 years from what they could do in the original Star Wars to this. When you think about the special editions, and even at the time, I can remember them saying Empire was the one that they tweaked the least. That still looks fresh now, doesn't it?
It does.
And that effect still looks fresh now.
Do you think, though, I mean, you look at Jedi and there's so much going on, and obviously optical was really pushed to the limits on Jedi. And I remember interviewing Dennis Muren, and I said, do you think visual effects technology had reached its limits with optical when he'd got there, or did it have to go digital? And his opinion was, if digital hadn't have come along when it did, we would have just kept making optical better. I wonder how good optical would have got. Because optical is somebody making a collage as opposed to somebody putting a collage together in Photoshop, isn't it? It's more of a tactile thing because it's cellular, it's a real thing, celluloid and all that stuff. If digital hadn't have happened, I wonder how good optical would have got.
Well, we've now kind of got the tail wagging the dog, where we've got the volume, where the effects that would have been done at a later stage are now actually filmed before, and the actors are now getting a far more, well, they're getting a spot-on representation of what the background is.
We're seeing this on Obi-Wan, aren't we?
Yeah.
The actors are responding to it really well.
Ewan's already mentioned about it, and so is Hayden, saying, it's so much easier, more natural reactions to what's going on than trying to hit something green that's dangling in front of you. I think certainly I can remember them talking about the scene in Attack of the Clones with the Geonosians, where they're saying that was real difficult to envisage. We're just like throwing a stick at like things that are coming towards us that are painted green or blue. That technology had to develop first to get to where we are now with the volume. I mean, the volume, as far as I know, is there just the one volume that they share for everything, or was there more now?
No, there's more now. So there's one in Australia, there's certainly one at Pinewood, the one in California, and that's just the Lucasfilm ones.
I was going to say, these are all Lucasfilm ones, and once that technology beds in, the possibilities for how that could be used as an entertainment thing for us to go along to, that's when immersive becomes immersive. Yeah. That's what I'm looking forward to.
With vehicles like, well, any of the vehicles we're talking about on Start Your Engines, but especially things like, I mean, we've seen it already with the Falcon, there's Smuggler's Run. Yeah. Star Tours has been around for forever and a day, 87, that originally opened and is still absolutely awesome. But you think vehicles like TIE Fighter, reading through this and going through the technical stats of a TIE Fighter, and we see it in Mando, like I say, we've mentioned Gideon's ship, it's a slightly different version of the TIE Fighter, but it's still basically a TIE Fighter. Just to be able to realise that now, what a treat.
All we need now is for a film that's got the TIE Fighter from that original timeline. And, we're hoping we're going to get something with this Rogue Squadron.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, I think that was originally slated for the end of 2023.
Yeah.
I think that's likely to be pushed down a year at least.
I'd certainly say, yeah.
All hopes are on that, including the TIE Fighter as well as the X-Wing, which has obviously been used in the graphic for the launch of that project. That's when I think we'll get to see the TIE Fighter in its truest sense, and we'll get a proper feel for the speed and how it actually flows, not only in space, but sort of like close to the surface of a planet, and also whether it is better or not as good as an X-Wing.
Famous moments.
So, of all the famous and memorable TIE Fighter moments, I mean, you work your way through the list of battles. Battle of Scarif, obviously, the escape from the Death Star, the Battle of Yavin, Asteroid Field from Empire, the escape from Bespin, being chased towards the Executor, and then the Battle of Endor. If you had to pick one major moment that if you were trying to show somebody who'd never seen a TIE Fighter before, this is that vessel at its best, which one would you pick, do you think?
Without any doubt whatsoever, the Asteroid Field. Everything about that is spot on. The music fits with the sequence. Yeah. The visuals are great. The actual sense of jeopardy is there, not only for the Falcon, but for the TIE Fighters.
Yeah.
You just could not have imagined them doing that 3 years earlier.
Oh, no.
And it still looks good now. When I watched Solo and they dropped a little bit of that theme into it, I thought, oh, brilliant. And again, we got TIE Fighters in that. And there's a nice little shot actually in Solo where you can see through the side of the cockpit of the Falcon a TIE Fighter alongside it.
And he
almost racing it. Yeah, and he dinks it, That was quite sweet. But yeah, for me, it's definitely the Asteroid Field.
Escape from the Death Star in A New Hope, they've been led through the Death Star like rats through a maze. They're being led towards their destination because it's all about putting the beacon on the ship.
Even the TIE Fighters going after the Falcon as it escapes, that's a dummy because they're being tracked.
And also, you've got the Death Star. Yeah, it's like how many TIE Fighters on a Star Destroyer? How many Star Destroyers could fit inside the Death Star? If they wanted to send 10,000 TIE Fighters after them, they clearly could. Yeah. It's just give them a bit of peril to feel the adrenaline enough to get away. But yeah, I think Battle of Endor, but I always think TIE Interceptors for Endor. Yeah. Especially going through the Death Star as well.
Yeah, I think because there are other class fighters in there, it sort of it dilutes it a bit, doesn't it? But also, there's so many of them. It's like a swarm of wasps coming at you, isn't there? You look at it and you think, whereas in that asteroid field scene, you can pick out the individual ones as they're being destroyed. Rocks are crushing them, there's things clipping wings and they're spinning towards the screen. It was almost like it was being made for 3D. No, it wasn't, because 3D, it had its heyday before that. It was
gone by then.
Yeah, and then it came around again towards the end of the 20th century. Yeah. That scene, it was almost like it was made for that.
I would agree. I'd say in terms of weight of numbers and sort of heaviness of peril, if that's even a phrase, Battle of Scarif, when they're being deployed from the shield gate, that was a really impactful scene. When the battle's happening over Scarif, over the ground, TIE strikers, in atmosphere, TIE fighters, so you see that whole scene when they all launch. So that shows you a massive threat, the weight of numbers and such. But I agree. I think the asteroid field, Solo's at his peak, the Falcon's flying like a bird, everything's in their favour. Ingenuity, quickness of thought, and luck, as always with Solo, gets them through it. But you think, though, they're probably 4 of the hottest TIE fighter pilots. They're not just 4 dudes who just happen to be there. They've sent out their best guys to get them, haven't they?
Yeah, I bet they are the elite.
That's the end of our second technical manual. We've looked at the TIE Fighter, we've gone through the original trilogy and touched on all sorts of stuff. We will be back in 6 weeks, and yeah, we'll talk about something else that's got engines. So thanks for listening to our second technical manual of Start Your Engines. If you want to be a part of the action and stay updated on all the latest Star Wars news, visit fanthatracks.com or check out the free Fanthatracks app through the App Store to follow us on your mobile device. You can also reach out to us and email us with your listeners' questions by emailing radio@fanthatracks.com. So if there's any ships you want to talk about, any questions you've got about stuff we've talked about, if there's any amendments you may have picked up that we might not have done, we'll talk about anything and everything, won't we, Mr. Naylor?
We're always right.
Comment, like and share at any of our social media feeds at Fanthatracks, and be sure to subscribe, leave a review, preferably a 5-star one, on Amazon Music, Audible, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcatcher or smart speaker of choice. And as always, thanks to James Semple for composing the Fanthatracks intro, and Mark Daniel and Vanessa Marshall for our voiceovers. Remember, tune in to our Fanthatracks news show, Good Morning Tatooine. It's live Sunday evenings, 9 o'clock UK, 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific, on Facebook and YouTube. And every Friday evening, you can hear episodes from Fanthatracks Radio. You get episodes of Desert Planet Discs, Planet Leia, Panther from Down Under, Start Your Engines, and Cannon Fodder.
What he said.
That's the end. We're turning the engines off. That's it for Technical Manual 2 of Start Your Engines, and we'll see you next time.
Coming up next on Fanthatracks Radio, it's Making Tracks.